I think one of the things that is really underlying this, and it keeps coming up, is the election process. Should it be federalized and hand over to the federal government, or should it remain in the private sector? And I think that if we push for this to be federalized, we're really just pushing it in the same hands as the people who are being bought off by the private sector anyway. So I don't think federalizing it is necessarily the solution we need. Maybe putting it in charge of each state to independently control and report their election results. Because to me, as we see it now, we can't blame the corporations and then trust the politicians who are bought by those corporations.
Well, when I say the commons, I'm not talking about the federal government.
Right.
If you say public education is part of the commons, you can say it's part of the commons, and the boundary of that is a county or a city,
right,
or a school district, but it's still part of the commons. And historically, the vote has been part of the commons, and it has been at the level of the precinct.
Which I think is
and over the last 3 decades, what we've seen is that our vote has been privatized. It's been handed over to private corporations, who we go and we vote on their machines, and then they tell us who we voted for. And it's got nothing to do with federal dollars. I mean, it came about in part through that process. But this is a horror show.
It is.
And it's compounded by the fact that we don't have nonpartisan administration of elections. Most of these states have secretaries of states or the heads of their boards of elections that are partisan, and you have 13,000 jurisdictions all handling the elections, and you have chaos in many of them in terms of how do the voters get on the voter registration. I mean, we don't do it like other countries where you're pretty much on from birth. We make it complicated with a highly mobile society. As people move and they don't understand, they're no longer registered to vote. How do we purge those voter election rolls? How do they clean them up? That was part of the crisis with Katherine Harris in Florida, right? How are we, what kinds of requirements and burdens are we putting on people to be able to vote? Now with voter ID that you have to show up in many states with, that is not necessarily easily accessible for a certain percentage of the population. And then you just have rank and file bias in terms of how people are treated, because a particular administrator is of one major party or the other and does not look in favor upon either third party and independent candidates or somebody from the opposite party. And we also have that at the federal level with the Federal Election Commission is stacked with 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, no independents, no third-party candidates. The law isn't written that way, but that's the way it's been, and it needs to change.
And I think part of the wake-up process for the population has been this election cycle. We saw that corruption that used to be intended for people on the other side actually focused on their own parties. What the Republicans have done in Maine, what the Democrats did on national stage at their convention, what the Republicans did on stage at their national convention, has people in their own parties kind of waking up to the fact that, wait a second, this system is broken. And my fear is whenever we talk about a broken system and that it's in the private control, there's always this knee-jerk reaction to say, okay, federal government, you take care of it. So I think we have to be careful when we have this discussion, where that discussion leads.
But Theresa raised a really important question. If you've got 13,000 precincts or independent jurisdictions, thank you, and one says, we're going to do a literacy test if you happen to be African American, and another says, we're going to charge a tax. At what point do we, the people nationally, say, no, wait a minute, we're going to put some boundaries on this. There needs to be some oversight. And at what point do you say, no, that's none of your business, federal government?
Great point, and it makes for a great conversation, because right now when we say, okay, you're absolutely right, that is a problem, that is an issue, but if we look to the federal government to fix it, we need what exactly you said, we the people, because the federal government
I'm all about the fix. Not going to be a quick fix, but it's actually easier than what we've been led by the two-party system to believe. And in studying the origins of the Constitution, there's a reason why our forefathers didn't mention corporations. They didn't mention parties. In fact, Madison himself said parties are evil. And so here at Free and Equal Elections, we're here to unite essentially the grassroots movement, all of you out there across the political spectrum, everyone here, to find that common denominator, because it has been the two-party system that's been taking smaller issues and kind of sidetracking us, the bigger issues that, well, they've been playing us since, over a century now, since the creation, as you all know, I've interviewed with you, of the Australian ballot. And the ballot access barriers, again, I have to emphasize in Theresa Amato's book, I have become an expert between Theresa Amato and my mentor, Richard Winger of Ballot Access News, my mentor for over 5 years. Love him so much, election law expert throughout the United States. what I have learned is that these ballot access barriers, there used to be lots of parties, and then suddenly these barriers came, and then there's two parties. And as you mentioned, the Federal Election Commission Act of 1974, these two things are the lifeline of the two parties. So how are you going to break that? Do you have any ideas of independent movement of people next year running for office, maybe for 14?
Well, I think Thom is onto something when it says we the people, and that should represent the federal government. But because we have this tendency to believe it doesn't, that's exactly why we're here right now. I mean, we're under the impression that the same people that we put in Washington, D.C., who none of us trust, it has a 12% approval rating, are the same people then that we should trust when it comes to hearing our voice and then counting our votes. And if that were true, we wouldn't be here. And so we need to look at the importance of gaining some sort of control over we the people, which is emphasized by the importance of running for those local offices, county, city, state, and create a buffer for the people while we're figuring out what to do on that national level. I think it has to be almost a blend of two systems, both we the people as a federal entity, and then we the people as individuals on a state and county level as well.
I think one of the things that's important, and congratulations to Free and Equal for hosting a transpartisan debate, is that we tend to think of in this country, and the way it's used is that bipartisan is a good thing because people are thinking, oh, well, people are cooperating. But bipartisan, it does not mean transpartisan. What it does is it uses the language to reinforce the notion that there are only two parties, and that goes to exclude the other voices. We've heard tonight from 4 candidates who are representing wildly different parts of the political spectrum. Yeah. Certainly in other countries where they have hundreds of candidates and several major parties, the people in those countries get to hear from across the spectrum. Here we discuss issues in one narrow sector of the political spectrum without other voices getting a chance to be heard. So you're not going to hear about the failed drug war, and you're not going to hear about should we be cutting the military budget and getting out of the wars when everybody's agreeing on these issues in the two parties with the two-party nominees. In 2004, for example, we were in 2 wars, and we had no major party candidate as an anti-war candidate in 2004. And so if we don't allow for more discussion across the spectrum, the American people are not hearing all the ideas that are out there.
I know we have a special guest coming up shortly. I'm going to have to step away for a moment to make things move, and please keep going, and I'll be back in just a few moments.
Well, and I think what we were talking about, Thom, is representative of that. I mean, we have the two parties who, if we were to give them control, they would run this exactly the way we've seen it ran.
But they do have control.
Well, right, but if the parties that are in power now had control of the election process and we trusted them to have an opportunity for everybody's voice to be heard, the 4 candidates who are here tonight would have been on their stages as well.
Perhaps. I think that there's a difference between how we bring candidates to the public, which is one entire area of discussion. Should there be, should we say, for example, that our airwaves are part of the commons? And if so, do we have the power to exercise some control over them? Up until 1987, when Reagan stopped enforcing it, the Fairness Doctrine said that if you want to use the public airwaves, you have to provide public service. That public service was called news. There had to be actual news. Back before 87, I was working in a newsroom back in the late 70s in Lansing, Michigan, and we had 5 people in the news department at WITL in Lansing, and the station lost money on their news, but that was the cost of keeping their license. And if I was even seen talking to a salesperson, I would be fired. 87 comes along, Reagan blows that up. 8 months later, CBS takes their news division, which had bureaus all over the world, hundreds of employees, because that was the cost of all their affiliates being able to carry all their other 23 hours of programming, and they put that under the head of their vice president of entertainment. And now we have infotainment. We have, and out of that then came then there was a need for a commission on presidential elections, because it was no longer the Nixon-Kennedy debates, because this is the commons and the networks have to do it. And Reagan just did incredible damage to us with that.
Yes, and
then
all
Obama
that money
repealed
is
the law last
and
month.
all that money is going to the TV stations
Yes,
now,
of course. Right.
So
Making $2
we
billion
have to stop, unfortunately, but fortunately, because we have with us Rob Ritchie, the executive director of Fair Vote, who's with us by Skype. Rob, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You can.
Great. Technology works.
So, Rob, we're talking about, Thom had been talking about how much money in the system is going to television companies and the decrease in free coverage of the candidates. Now the candidates have to pay for it. Should we be having some kind of free airtime, which has been proposed in legislation but never voted on in terms of getting passage for the candidates, so that so that the candidates don't have to spend so much money and raise so much money from corporate interests and others to be able to conduct and get out their message. Yeah. Rob, you're the executive director of Fair Vote. You've been there many years, and you have a number of outstanding publications on your website, fairvote.org. And can you tell us a little bit about some of the alternative systems that we should be looking at to reform our electoral process?
Sure. Well, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to the debate. And we are, as we're stuck with this seemingly media fixation on only two parties, we also seem to be stuck on a set of 18th century electoral rules and processes, but in fact we're not. Just as we could and should be looking outside the two-party system, we also can be looking outside some of these old rules. So that's what Fair Vote's trying to do, is sort of move to democracy 2.0. With a lot of tested ideas, radical ideas like having a popular vote for president, as we do for everything else except president, and changing winner-take-all elections, our sort of fundamental goal, to some kind of proportional representation, meaning that 10% of the vote should win 10% of the seats, 50% of the vote should win 50% of the seats, and there's a range of different systems to do that. And it's interesting, a lot of cities are actually exploring different ways of electing people that would better accommodate choice and provide fair representation. It's something that we really can win in this country, and that's what we're trying to profile at fairvote.org.
Now, this can be done without a constitutional amendment, is that right? And if so, how?
Well, the National Popular Vote proposal, just one aspect, which is getting away from this current electoral college system, is based on powers that states have to control their electors and to also be able to work with other states. And that's a state statute. It's passed in 8 states and D.C., and if it passes in states representing a majority of the electoral college, it will control the next election. That can be done all through state legislation. Proportional representation would take an act of Congress to allow states to use multi-member districts, meaning a person would have more than one representative. So a state with, say, 5 members of Congress, rather than having 5 one-seat districts, would have them all go statewide, but it would take 20% of the vote to win 1 out of 5. And that's something that can be done by statute. It's not a constitutional issue. And of course, ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, which will be part of the selection process for the next stage of the debates, that's something that can be done by simple statute also.
Now, isn't it also true that this top tier movement, the Stop Top 2 movement, is actually addressing a similarly important issue where we're seeing the inability to have contenders who are true contenders? They have the lack of access to the ballots in most states currently, correct?
Well, certainly, ballot access is a big factor, and then this new Top 2 proposal, which is now the law in California and Washington, on the ballot in Arizona, would limit our choices in general elections always to 2 candidates, and the first round, the sort of preliminary round, would almost always eliminate everyone outside the major parties, so that you would generally only have November ballot choices among 2 major party candidates and not even have an opportunity to write in or consider a third-party candidate, and that's obviously a problem for voter choice and fair debate.
How did that get to be law in California?
It comes from something that we can at least see as hopeful. Voters are fed up with the way we do things now, and so this was proposed as a way to hold politicians more accountable, to get fair representation. Really a lot of things that we think better reforms would achieve. But voters were ready to hear that message. It also had a lot of money behind it. It was on the ballot in June 2010, and it won. But
the risk is that it could lessen choice dramatically, and how it's played out in Louisiana, for example. Rob, could you go and tell us a little bit about the reason behind the national popular vote plan? Because people are talking in the 2012 elections the distinct possibility that there could be an electoral tie in the Electoral College. And we would, in 2000, people saw that the popular vote didn't match the electoral outcome vote. And in 2004, but for 60,000 plus votes in Ohio, that was very contentious and people suspected that you had the same situation where you had George Bush, the incumbent, winning more of the popular vote, but had Kerry won Ohio, it would have been another situation where the outcome of the popular vote did not match the Electoral College vote. In that case, it did, but I think that's part of the genesis of this national popular vote plan. Could you explain how that would work?
Yeah, and you lay out, some of the problems, key problems very well. This tie vote in the Electoral College, by the way, actually, has an insane tie-breaking procedure where the Senate picks the vice president on the basis of one senator per vote, and then the House picks the president based on one state per vote. So Wyoming gets one vote, Alaska gets one vote, California gets one vote, right? And whoever gets the most votes among states becomes president. And that's still a relatively unlikely possibility, but you can break down the remaining swing states, and it's at least a plausible outcome. But and then the wrong way winner, as you say, for 2000, almost 2004, and what we see as a particularly crazy for the idea of respecting every vote is this handful of swing states get all the attention. The candidates focus like a laser beam, the major party candidates at least, just on 8 or 9, 10 states, and they completely ignore everybody else, which does create an opportunity for third-party candidates to particularly try to appeal to votes there, but of course, try to get votes everywhere. But there is a fertile ground, perhaps, for people who are being ignored. So national popular vote is a state law where states enter into an interstate compact, and we have a lot of interstate compacts. I live here in D.C., and so the metro system is a product of an interstate compact among our subway system, Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. But there's hundreds of these compacts, and it's state agreements that in a sense are like treaties. And the treaty is an agreement to say, we support wanting a national popular vote for president. We want to guarantee that outcome. And because we control electoral votes, we actually have the power to do that. They agree to give all of their electoral votes, not to the winner of the statewide popular vote, but to the winner of the national popular vote in all 50 states in D.C. And that they will have this law kick in, become active, once the number of states passed it, as a controlling majority in the Electoral College, meaning they have at least 200 electoral.
Thank you for laying that out. Rob, you've talked about in the past how so many of the congressional districts have been gerrymandered that we really have an uncompetitive situation in the vast majority of the congressional districts that are either drawn to favor one major party or the other major party. And so people believe the election's a foregone conclusion, and so other voices don't choose to run or get heard because it's so stacked. Can you talk a little bit about how rigged our congressional system is with how the lines are drawn for the congressional districts and why that produces an uncompetitive situation and what could be done about it?
Yes, I mean, it's, we don't even have a pretense of a two-party system for most of us in legislative elections. It's really a one-party system, to the point that, say, the state of Georgia, the Democratic Party is not even running candidates in half the legislative districts. So they're not even pretending to compete in even half the districts. But even when they're trying to compete, most districts are lopsided. Most districts really lean one way or the other, just like states do in the presidential race. It's, even more districts are more likely to lean one way. And redistricting, gerrymandering exacerbates this. Because the politicians get to fine-tune their districts and get a little more voters to help them, or put some voters outside of their district that they don't want there. So it makes an already very bad situation worse. So that for us, the core problem is winner take all, and we lay this out well. We'd love to have people check out fairvotingus.com. They can link to it from fairvote.org as well. But we show U.S. House races as they are, with all the data you need to kind of understand what's likely to happen, and it's the partisan tilts, the racial dynamics of each district, and then show what a proportional representation system would look like. And you can see, using real numbers, what a dramatic difference it would make. And that's something we can do by statute. And I think the numbers speak for themselves about what it would mean for voters all voters having a chance to participate in the election.
Rob, oh, go ahead. Oh, Rob, you talked a little bit about representation. There is a threat to the vote, and I'd like you to address it. It's this idea that corporations can give unlimited funds to super PACs. What is stopping, let's say, a Chinese corporation from setting up an American firm, donating millions of dollars, even really a drug cartel for, exactly. Even a drug cartel from Mexico setting up a company and donating millions of dollars. From your perspective, how does that impact the representation of the people who are trying to have true representation of the people they're voting for?
Right. Well, there's some great groups working on these issues. I'm sure perhaps you've heard from Move to Amend and the Common Cause, and so there's a spectrum of groups taking different approaches, but all trying to get to a point of public financing, trying to deal with Citizens United. I would say that it's going to be a tough nut to crack because money does flow through our system, and it's hard to control, but it must be taken on, and we kind of applaud people doing so. I just say that some of these changes that would also.
30 seconds. Rob?
Rob, real quickly, in just a few seconds, you said that this can be done by legislation. Do we have any legislative angels out there? Anybody working on it?
Yes, well, there's a lot happening in the states, and I think in Congress we'll see legislation to push for proportional representation. We've had bills for most of the last 20 years in Congress. Cynthia McKinney, the Green Party candidate from 2008 when she was in Congress, had bills. But I think the system is broken to the extent that deep within the major parties there's now interest in some changes. It's going to be a tough battle, but I think it's winnable. So check out fairvote.org, and very soon we'll have Fair Vote actions on how to get involved.
Thank you so much, Rob Ritchie, fairvote.org, for joining us. And we haven't had a chance to talk about the campaign financing system, but certainly the statute will only go so far. We're going to need a constitutional amendment to fix Citizens United if we're going to really get into whether we can be a country that is publicly financed and not corporate financed for our elections.
Yeah, although, you're going to get a lot of people saying, wait a minute, are you talking about a federal law involving itself in federal constitutions? No, wait a minute. Federal government shouldn't have that much power. We have to figure out where the appropriate boundaries are, where the appropriate power lies, and how that power gets administered. And how we prevent the corruption of that power. And I think your Citizens United question speaks to that in a big way.
Well, I think so too, because right now, I mean, what I'm really excited about what we're having this conversation about, because we didn't see this on any of the other mainstream news networks. They weren't talking about any of these issues.
They were not.
So that right there, to me, is a symbol that we're moving in the right direction with this movement. And I don't even think it's right to call it a movement, because there's so many people from so many backgrounds and so many political parties that are realizing, even if I support my party, the system in which we're using to gain access to ballots and to gain access to debates just isn't fair.
Right.
So how would you, Theresa, you wrote the book on it, how would you suggest, where should we start the day after the elections when it's time for activism to begin?
Well, I don't think it's something we should start the day after elections. I think we have to be involved citizens every single day between the elections, during the electoral process, because certainly the two parties are working on a absolutely they don't take a break, and so people who want to increase the justice level of our elections, who want to fix a broken process, have to be doing this and being vigilant and
what's
participating.
The first step in your mind?
First
Where
step,
do people go?
I think absolutely.
What can our viewers do right now?
Obviously, I wrote a whole discussion about this, having been in the two-party vortex with the third party and independent candidate, Ralph Nader, in 2000-2004, and seeing how unfair that process was. So there are many steps. There's so much information out there. You can look at what you want to focus on: nonpartisan elections, fair ballot access, being able to host these kinds of debates, being able to have better media, and
just with seconds left, wouldn't freeandequal.org be a great place for people to start if they're watching this?
Absolutely. The host of our transpartisan debate this evening, that the 6 top ballot qualified candidates were invited to attend. So we are getting close to being able to take you to the debate. But Thom, you have talked about the role of corporations in our electoral process. You certainly
I wrote a book about it.
Several, right? And if there were one place that you would send people outside of Free and Equal, what would that be?
Well, and outside of the groups that have been mentioned, I would say movetoamend.org. I think we've been wrapped.
I think so.
I think
this
so.
is your debate.
Thank you for joining us. We're going to take you live to Larry King and to Christina Tobin.